It is one of the most beautiful things in Holland. It is, however, in no sense Dutch. The painting is Dutch only because it is the work of a Dutchman. No other Dutch painter could compass such liquid clarity, such cool surfaces. Indeed, none of the others seemed to have tried. A different ideal was theirs. Apart, however, from the question of technique, upon which I am not entitled to speak, the picture has to me human interest beyond description. There is a winning charm in this simple Eastern face that no words of mine can express. All that is hard in the Dutch nature dissolves beneath her reluctant smile. She symbolizes the fairest and sweetest things in the 11 provinces. She makes Holland sacred ground.
During a 2-year program of building, renovation and reconstruction, the painting Girl with a Pearl Earring embarked on a global tour with other treasures from the world-famous Mauritshuis Museum in The Hague. She was the tour's poster girl and attracted enormous crowds wherever she went. Now she's returning home to a growing sense of excitement as the Mauritshuis, one of Europe's leading art galleries, reopens to the public once again. But what is it about this 17th century picture, this mysterious Dutch girl, painted by Johannes Vermeer, that has projected her to such iconic status? Who is this Mona Lisa of the North?
We've seen the girl with a pearl earring all over the world recently, starting in The Hague, then going to Japan, the US, Italy, and she's really captured everyone's imagination. And the question, I often got the question, what makes her so special? And it was interesting to get this question in various different countries, and you would see that that she really has a kind of universal appeal. I think this comes down to a number of factors. I wish I could give you one straight answer, but let's start with the obvious, and she's absolutely gorgeous. She's a beautiful girl, and she is something you really want to look at. The composition's very clever. You see a brightly colored figure against a dark background, which in a sense projects her into our space and really invites us to engage with her. That is, of course, only strengthened by her gesture, the way she looks over her shoulders. Her mouth is slightly parted. There's a little tiny fleck of paint on the corner of her lips that just indicates she just is saying something. Her whole attitude is very much inviting. It invites you to engage with her.
It's simplicity. And absolutely simple, just the head, just the person, no background, no reference to a place. I think it's a timelessness that is really rooted in the relationship between the artist and the subject. It gives you this entry, a psychological entry, if you like, to the person without any sort of veils of materialism.
You feel very close physically to her when you look at the painting, which I think is quite different from the Mona Lisa, where I feel extraordinary distance, like massive amount of space emotionally and physically between myself and the image of the Mona Lisa. With the girl with a pearl earring, she seems like somebody who you could afford to be familiar with, and I think she's very sexy, actually. She's not provocatively beautiful, but there's something very, very attractive about her. And I think it's entirely in the way it's painted, not in what she looks like.
I think what's most alluring about the painting is that it's unresolved and unresolvable. I've looked at it for many, many years, and I still don't know what she's thinking. I still don't know if it's a happy painting or a sad painting. And that seems like such a basic thing to be able to unpack about a painting. You ought to be able to know what you're looking at. But actually, Vermeer has somehow managed to capture in her a whole lot of contradictions.
To meet this girl's gaze is to be implicated in its urgency. It is me at whom she gazes, with real, unguarded human emotions, and with an intensity that demands something just as real and human in return. One grows complicit in the painting's own impossible desires. Her eyes sharpen the underlying mood into something poignant and piercing, and focus it on the artist, on the viewer, with a mixture of reproach and regret. The act of looking is haunted here by suggestions of violation and betrayal. Is it our life that makes her real? Is it her vibrancy of being that we lack and long for?
It's her eyes, the one pearl earring, and her lips. And they have these white dots of paint. And it's like they've been anointed with paint rather than softly focused. So they look extremely shiny, but there's a wetness about it. And I think that one of the things that makes paintings of people look great is if you can make the eyes and the lips look wet. And it's funny because everybody, you know, the catchword is earring and pearl. And yet, I think what he's done is said, these lips, these eyes, they're like pearls, and they shine, and they're wet and of the water.
So it's all about illusion, and that's also very smart of an artist like Johannes Vermeer, who must have been a perfect observer of reality, because first you have to understand reality to make an illusion of it, of course. And he somehow knew when you look at a pearl, it's all about the reflection, and that's all you have to paint, just a reflection, and then you've got a pearl. Also, when you look at her face, she has no eyebrows, but you don't need them. And for some reason, the bow of her nose, it's not there. It's all like brushed out. But you don't notice. When you look at her, it's just beauty. And you don't think something is missing, not at all. But also working, I think, with somehow he understood how the brain works. That you can leave things out and make it more perfect and more real by leaving it.
We think frequently of Dutch paintings, and even my academic colleagues will write like, you know, what is Vermeer's or Rembrandt's message in this picture? What is he saying to the people of his time? For the most part, they're not talking to the people of their time. It's not a media experience like a broadcast. It's one picture for one individual that sat in a private collection for a long time. And so much of what Vermeer does is addressed to a voyeur who knows he's a voyeur.
The conundrum that revolves around the girl with a pearl earring is that Vermeer's model has never been identified, and there is no evidence to confirm who she is. Could she be his daughter, his wife, a servant, or someone from the street, a neighbor perhaps? Many debate this issue, but the lack of evidence adds to her mystery and allure.
I was lying in bed one morning, and the painting was on the wall opposite the bed, and I looked at it, just sort of idly thinking about it, and I suddenly thought, I wonder what Vermeer did to her to make her look like that. And it was the first time I had ever thought about the girl's expression actually being to do with the painter. Before, that had been disconnected somehow. But this time I realized, to myself anyway, that this was not a portrait of a person. It was more like a portrait of a relationship. And everything she felt about him was right there in her face. So I got up and I went and got out the exhibition catalog from the show and read about the painting and more about Vermeer. And I discovered that they have no idea who she is. They don't know who any of the models in his paintings are. They suspect that they are his, mostly women. They're probably his wife and daughters, because he had a lot of daughters, but they don't know. And I looked at it and I thought, well, I want to write about this. And since they don't know, that's great, because I can make up whatever I want.
The fame of Girl with a Pearl Earring is a modern phenomenon. For 200 years, no one even knew where the painting was. In fact, even its painter, Johannes Vermeer, was essentially forgotten too, until a French art historian called Théophile Torre-Burger wrote several articles about Vermeer, which led to his rediscovery in the middle of the 19th century. In 1881, a dirt-encrusted painting of a girl came up for auction in The Hague. Only 2 experts suspected the picture was of Vermeer, A.A. de Thom and Victor de Steurs, an influential civil servant, who campaigned for Dutch art to remain in the Netherlands. The 2 men were neighbors in The Hague and decided to hatch a plan to acquire the painting.
Victor Steurs and de Thom went together to a sale in The Hague, and they agreed not to bid against each other. They went as friends. De Thom was a collector. Victor de Steurs had produced copious notes about his collection, and also a patron of the arts. And Victor de Steurs was totally involved in what is nowadays called heritage. De Thom bought it for 2 guilders, 30 cents. It was very dirty, and de Thom had already at that point decided, I think, to give his collection when he died to the Mauritshuis, which in his will they acquired it when he died. Victor Steurs never stopped drawing. This, I think, is probably the earliest one. I would guess done at the sale, because he's written underneath it to de Thom. And then there's another sketch in which the inscription says de Thom bought it for 2 florins 30 and lent it to the Mauritshuis, which is exactly what he did do. All 3 drawings that we have were drawn in the same year that it was bought. The third one is a much more finished drawing, in which it's, in the catalogue, the entry just says belongs to MC de Thom in The Hague, and it says it's signed and it is attributed to Vermeer.
The Girl with a Pearl Earring may never have come to light if the picture had not been recognized and restored. It sometimes seems remarkable that any painting survives through the centuries, with exposure to changing conditions and different owners. But many things can be learned about a painting and the original intentions of an artist when highly skilled conservators use technology to examine a picture, looking beyond what is visible to the naked eye and analyzing the material it is made of.
Well, the Girl with Pearl Earring entered the collection at the end of the 19th century, and it wasn't until 1960 that it was then that it was treated in the Mauritshuis. When it was treated again in the 1990s, the natural resin varnish had really discolored to a point that it was no longer considered presentable. The varnish was actually quite brown, And the first thing that's done after examination of the painting is actually to take an X-ray to have a clear indication of the state of the painting or its condition. And it became immediately clear from the X-ray that there are a multitude of tiny losses over the entire painting. But fortunately, they're mostly small in scale and scattered over the surface and not located in one particular area, for instance, in the face. I think a lot of people have an idea that paint is actually, very stable and nothing much can happen to it. But in fact, paint is pigments bound in an oil binder, in the case of traditional oil paintings. That's applied on top of a ground layer, on top of a support. Now, that support can be canvas or it can be panel. And of course, temperature and relative humidity affect the shrinkage and expansion of those layers individually, and over time can cause delaminations or tiny losses. The picture has also been framed, often in many cases several times. That could also have caused cracks in the painting. So we're looking at these tiny damages and monitoring to making sure that they're not increasing in size, that there's no further damage to the painting. But I think as a conservator, I think we're rarely tempted to make things more beautiful than they really are. When the picture was treated in the 90s, there were details that were uncovered that had been covered over by a previous restoration. So you can say that a restoration can reveal features of a painting that have been previously unknown. For instance, the little highlight on the lip had been covered over by previous retouching. So this is a really important feature of the picture because it actually makes her lips look more fresh and glistening. And that was a feature that was covered over, and there was an extra highlight on the pearl earring that in fact was an upturned paint flake. So the process of restoring can actually brings the picture closer to what the artist intended.
The man who painted Girl with a Pearl Earring was born in Delft in 1632. Johannes Vermeer was the son of a silk merchant who also ran an inn and dealt in the sale of artworks. Little is known about Vermeer's youth until he asks to marry a local Catholic girl called Catharina Bolnes in 1653. Her mother, Maria Thins, seems to have opposed the marriage until Vermeer converted to Catholicism. Vermeer and his young wife then moved in with Maria, where they set up home. Catharina would eventually give birth 15 times, with 11 of those children surviving to adulthood. Remarkably, Johannes also found time to be a painter.
I find Vermeer intriguing as a painter because apart from the droplets of white paint that bring shine to the very last touches of making the image, I can't really work out how the rest of the picture is made. It's extremely clever, and in modern language it doesn't reveal its process. If you look at a Rembrandt, you can follow the brush strokes. They get more complicated as they get into the face, but around the clothing, you can see how he's matching gesture to folds of cloth or wrinkledness to the way a brush is scrubbed around a cheek or something. But with Vermeer, I really cannot work out how he does it. And so it looks like a kind of photographic emulsion to me that has been almost processed wet in a tray. It hasn't been put on as sticky stuff with a hairy brush. So there's magic. It's just a celebration of skill. I think he must have been a very clever man.
Vermeer has very thin layers that he will blend together, whites over blues or yellows, and different color relationships he's trying out. When you look under a microscope at a pearl, you might see a pool of milky paint, maybe with a blue base behind that, and then he'll drop just a pinhead of brilliant white, lead white on top of that. And it will look from a certain distance like pearls blurred as if in a slightly out of focus camera, which is realistic enough. I mean, our eye doesn't take in with sharp focus anybody, but if we're looking at someone, we'll be focused on a particular area and another area will be somewhat blurred. Blurring in an illusionistic picture actually makes it look more realistic, I think. But these things read from a distance as an optical experience that many people say, oh, he must have had some form of camera or some other analogy, some secret trick which describes reality in that way. And he does in a way because he's been experimenting with different techniques that render daylight. And the colors being yellow and blue and then a touch of red in the lips. Vermeer keeps doing the primaries over and over again, red, blue, yellow, or slight mixtures of them in very careful harmonic relationships. So there's all of these elements that you could describe as composition, which make this picture so easy to look at and so intriguing.
It's not known where Vermeer learned his craft or with whom he studied, but some scholars think he may have been influenced by Rembrandt, who lived in Amsterdam and was much older than him. We do know that he became a respected citizen of Delft and a prominent member of the Guild of St. Luke, and, like his father before, he valued and dealt in selling art. He was not a prolific painter, and it is thought that he took a long time to complete a work. His known output numbers around 36 pictures. Vermeer lived his whole life in Delft, which was an important center of trade. His close relationship with the city is captured in what many believe to be one of the greatest cityscapes ever painted, View of Delft. The French writer Marcel Proust thought it was the most beautiful painting he'd ever seen. In his monumental novel In Search of Lost Time, published in 1913, he created a character, an art critic, who is fatally overcome by Vermeer's genius.
He was in front of that Vermeer which he remembered as dazzling, more different than all that he had known, but where, thanks to the critic's article, he noticed for the first time small blue figures, and he also noticed that the sand was pink, and finally, the precious matter of that small patch of yellow wall. His dizzy spells increased. Like a child striving to grasp a yellow butterfly, his glance would attach itself to that precious small patch of wall. It's thus, he thought, that I should have written. My last books are too dry. They should have had several layers of color, should have rendered my phrase precious, just like this small patch of yellow wall. Nevertheless, the seriousness of his dizzy spells would not leave him. He repeated to himself, little patch of yellow wall with a dormer. But now he let himself fall on a circular settee. He fell to the floor where all the museum visitors and guards rushed to him. He was dead.
People have commented on how the shadows in the water have been extended, and actually in X-rays you see they're extended. They were in one place, then they're in another place, and other adjustments are made. And through where the light is cast on a building, Vermeer couldn't have recorded the pattern of light, shade, color, everything else in like an hour, which he would have to, given the lighting conditions outside, much less than that. This is the product of artistic decisions over months. So he's really pointing the viewer in certain directions. Another fascinating thing, which is almost never mentioned, is the clouds above the view of Delft. And they are deeply shaded on the underside. I actually think he probably saw a painting by Jacob van Ruisdael and lifted this idea, but he's looking at other landscapists. And quite as the landscape itself recedes over the water and back to the city, you could get the same effect turning the picture upside down and feel that sense of recession. In other words, the clouds create a ceiling that seems to be going into the picture and enhancing the depth also.
But look at all details, and especially a detail, for instance, with the boats in front. I like all the different kinds of colors he used just to suggest it has probably just rained, so these boats are wet. You see the reflection of the light because the sun is coming through again. This is really the mastery of the paint. And how did he do it? It's all kinds of different colors, different brush strokes, and you believe it. So when you see the painting, when you would enter the Vermeer room in the Mauritshuis, you would see this painting. It's almost like a window, an extra window in the room. Then you come close by, then of course you see it's a painting. And if you get even more close by, you really do see the paint, you see the skin.
Vermeer seems to have been affluent enough to support his large family until war broke out in 1672 and France invaded the Netherlands. He had fewer clients, and still only in his 40s, he sank into debt. By the age of 43, he was dead. Vermeer's genius flourished during a period that saw the Netherlands rise to one of the world's first global empires. The Dutch dominated the world's sea routes and opened up new channels of trade, especially with the East. Companies like the powerful and influential Dutch East India Company generated huge amounts of wealth, impacting in turn on the affluence of contemporary Dutch society. It was estimated that 5 million paintings were produced during a 75-year period known as the Dutch Golden Age. It was against this background that in 1633, Johann Maurits of Nassau-Siegen commissioned the building of the Mauritshuis in a very prominent position next to the Binnenhof in The Hague, the seat of the Dutch Parliament. The building was designed in a classical style by Jacob van Campen and was completed while Johann Maurits was away, performing his duties as the governor of Dutch Brazil. On his return, he filled his house with things he'd collected, from feathers to paintings. After his death in 1679, the house passed to the Maas family, who leased it to the Dutch government. In 1704, a fire destroyed most of the interior of the building, which was restored in an 18th century style some years later. The Mauritshuis was bought by the Dutch government in 1820 to house the Royal Cabinet of Paintings and Curiosities, and officially became a museum in 1822. Many paintings of the Dutch Golden Age, like Girl with a Pearl Earring, mix the exotic with the mysterious. Trade with the East meant that a vast array of sumptuous goods and foreign travelers arrived in the Netherlands. Everything from spices to textiles, decorative objects and strange animals began to appear in Northern Europe through trade.
You also see a transition from largely religious paintings that would have been done in earlier periods. So think, for example, about our painting by Roger van der Weyden, The Lamentation of Christ. These sorts of paintings would have been done for devotional purposes, for churches or private devotion. In the 17th century, in the northern Netherlands, people are using paintings in a very different way. They're not necessarily commissions for religious purposes, but they're often more decorative. So, for example, someone might have wanted a beautiful Italianate landscape on their wall, which was, as it were, a kind of vacation, you know, from the dreary Dutch climate. It's a very different idea from something that was done for religious purpose to something that had maybe a different function.
I think that's the miracle of the 17th century in the Netherlands. There was just an influx of people coming to the Dutch Republic from present-day Belgium, and because of the political situation there, so many people fled to the northern Netherlands. And these were talented artists. We already had talented artists in the country, so there was sort of a boom in painting. And of course you can make paintings, but there have to be clients, customers for that. The churches, for instance, were whitewashed. There were no commissions anymore for altar pieces. So artists had to look for different commissions, and they thought, well, what do we need to make in order to make a living? And so they started making a lot of landscapes or still lifes, and of course many portraits of very proud Dutch burghers who wanted themselves to be portrayed. And this is something that is quite unique, that you see. Well, they're almost painted as being a king or queen themselves. So this is really very remarkable and very typical also for the situation in the Dutch Republic. That is unique, I think, in Europe of the time.
It was a feature of Dutch and Flemish art of the time to produce paintings that were immersive and told a story. Vermeer was considered a master of composing simple scenes full of intrigue and mystery. His serene compositions always seem to suggest a more complex narrative. Who are the central characters in his paintings? We really don't know, which seems to be Vermeer's intention, but he was not alone in conjuring up illusion.
The girl with the pearl earring is something that specialists now call a trony, because that's what it's frequently described as in inventories. This is T-R-O-N-I-E, and it is a now defunct Dutch word. I'm told it's still used occasionally in police stations for mugshots and so on. Goes back to a now defunct French word, trône, and this refers to simply a head or expression, maybe suggesting a certain emotion, but it implies individuality, but at the same time anonymity. And tronies are frequently based on real people. And in the popular imagination, that's a portrait. And this picture has frequently been described as a kind of portrait.
Rembrandt was really important. I think without Rembrandt, Vermeer probably would not have painted his own tronies, because Rembrandt sort of popularized this theme of tronies. So he painted soldiers and young girls or old women as types. So these were never meant to be recognized as portraits. And also, if you would make a portrait of someone, someone had to pay you for that. So he used models from the street, he would dress them up, or if he didn't have models, he would dress himself up and then copy what he saw in the mirror. And this dressing up is something that, well, at least painters of the time, they like to do that.
The girl with the pearl earring is wearing a silk scarf on her head, and a colossal pearl, which probably couldn't have been a pearl at all, but a glass imitation. Such things were made in Venice at the time. And the turbans vaguely suggests Orientalism or the Middle East. And I think if the girl with the pearl earring were described in an inventory at the time, even though she does look like a Dutch face and the jacket itself is ordinary clothing, she would probably be described something like trony à la Turk, head in a Turkish fashion.
artists of the 17th century excelled in telling a story through the skillful rendering of a moment in time. Most would agree that the master of this was Rembrandt, an artist who had a great influence on painters of the day, and we think also on Vermeer. Rembrandt van Rijn is considered one of the preeminent stars of the Dutch Golden Age, and The Anatomy Lesson of Dr. Nicholas Tulp was an early masterpiece. It brilliantly displays his great ability to tell a story through clever composition and the rendering of light, a feature that would mark his career. Rembrandt wanted to be a history painter and tell stories in his work, and he was only 25 when he received the commission from the Guild of Surgeons to paint the leading surgeon of the day, Dr. Tulp. It was a great honor for such a young artist, but he did something different with his commission.
Since there were so many men to include in this picture, I decided to start with a pyramidal shape, as I have done with my new composition of Christ's descent from the cross, the one I'm working on for the Stadtholder. There is a beautiful cohesion that comes from a pyramidal structure. If you've got the geometry right, every point in the painting seems to relate to every other point. As the viewer, your eye is encouraged to move back and forth between the elements before settling directly into a single focus. You see different characters and give each of them your visual attention for as long as they interest you, and then your eye moves along to the next character, knowing that each one plays a role in the unfolding drama.
I think that many people throughout the years have tried to give voice to Rembrandt, and they've done it in many various ways. It's impossible to really know what Rembrandt spoke like or sounded like. He only wrote a handful of written notes, and all of them said something like, here's the painting that I've promised you, and you owe me the X amount of guilders for it. So we can't hear him. We can imagine what we hear based on looking at his works of art, which of course are also a form of documentation of his life. I thought that Rembrandt must have been an incredibly erudite man because of all the references that he brings to his works and all the things that he knew about Italian painting and everything about art history, really, without having ever left Holland. He had a good collection of books as well, which wasn't necessarily common for artisan painters of the day.
In this room, we have a beautiful collection of Jan Steen paintings, and what's interesting that we both have the largest painting by Jan Steen, As the Old Sing, So Pipe the Young, and also the smallest painting, The Oyster Eater.
When you look at paintings from the 17th century, important thing is you have to realize they were painted to entertain, for enjoyment, to look at them and see how beautiful they are or how funny the scene is which was depicted, but often they also contain a message. They have a deeper meaning.
We have in Dutch the expression the household of Jan Steen, where everything goes wrong and the children run around and don't listen to the parents, and the parents are smoking and drinking, giving the bad example to the young ones, and all of that you see in this painting. And we see the older generation, for instance, Jan Steen himself. It's a self-portrait. He often included himself to, as a funny footnote to his scenes, making a young boy smoke, and they're drinking, and in the middle there's the child. It's his baptism, and the man on the left, the older man, is wearing a cap, a hat that the young father would actually wear on the party where a young child is baptized, but he's much too old to be the father. So that's also the world upside down that you see there.
Genre paintings are paintings which show scenes from everyday life or inspired by everyday life, and different from history paintings which are based on written stories. These paintings are taken from everyday reality, but they do not imitate everyday reality. What painters did is add something to it, put a message in it for people to understand when they look at a painting.
With genre painting, one of the confusing things for a lot of people when they look at such a painting is that they think it's a social document, that it's exactly the way things were in the 17th century. And that's true for parts of it. There were tables like the one you see at As the Young Sing, So Pipe the Young. There were cans, as you see in this painting. People were eating fruit like that, but not exactly, because it's all representing something else, and it's idolized. There's something extra. The fruit, as it is on the table, is like a still life, so it's not like the way people would normally eat it. It's improved. It's made better. With the Jan Steen painting, sometimes he's referred to as like a director of a movie or of a play even, with people overacting, with strange faces, grimaces, strange laughing, and also wearing clothing that just don't make any sense sometimes.
The wonder of Vermeer, the reason that he looks so much like reality, is, I think, two-sided and kind of contradictory. One is his absolute absorption in visual experience. And I think he saw a great number of pictures. His father was an art dealer. He probably traveled more than we knew. I would think he'd gone to Amsterdam and visited Rembrandt or had seen Rembrandt's and other collections. And he certainly knew personally Karel Fabritius, who was perhaps Rembrandt's most brilliant pupil, who moved to Delft in the late 1640s. I think at least 2 tronies by Fabritius are listed in Vermeer's own inventory. And we don't know if he saw the goldfinch, probably.
It was a small picture, the smallest in the exhibition and the simplest. A yellow finch against a plain, pale ground, chained to a perch by its twig of an ankle. He was Rembrandt's pupil, Vermeer's teacher, my mother said. And this one little painting is really the missing link between the two of them, the clear, pure daylight. You can see where Vermeer got his quality of light from. I stepped back to get a better look. It was a direct and matter-of-fact little creature, with nothing sentimental about it. and something about the neat, compact way it tucked down inside itself, its brightness, its alert, watchful expression, made me think of pictures I'd seen of my mother when she was small. A dark-capped finch with steady eyes.
It's a very interesting comparison to the girl with the pearl earring, because here's this bird who is suddenly turning to the viewer, seen in profile, but the head is turned, and a close view set against a plain background. In that case, it's a brilliant daylight plaster wall, unlike the dark background in the Vermeer. But there's a contrast of light and shadow, which has been used to enhance the sense of an object in a shallow space. It's frequently shallow when it's figural, whether it's a bird or a person. There's also in the goldfinch these broad strokes that blend together as feathers and volume and so on at a distance, but create a sense of motion and light and atmosphere playing over the form.
The goldfinch is fast becoming an iconic painting in the Mauritshuis collection, and, like Girl with a Pearl Earring, is inspiring not only works of fiction, but also great devotion amongst an eager public. But what effect does this fame have on iconic masterpieces like these? Does it change the way we understand and appreciate them? Does it perhaps diminish them in any way?
It's very interesting when images become very well known. I would say it's images become well known, not paintings become well known, because most people never see the real thing. They just see the mechanical reproduction of that image on various surfaces, you know, which might range from the cover of a paperback book to a T-shirt, to a print on a wall, to an image on a mug. I don't think it actually diminishes the painting in any way, but it does give a lot of people the illusion that they have seen the picture and they know the painting, because they are physical things that are made out of stuff. They're not made out of printing ink, and they're not made through through a camera. They are made with brushes, with glues, with pigments, and like sculpture, they have a physical presence that is at least half of their visual quality.
And what it means is something about that look, that person. I mean, you know, you might say, why are some starlets in modern times so haunting to a generation and other equally pretty people not? And it's something magical in their physiognomy, the way they hold themselves, and also the way they're lit by professionals and treated on camera. So Vermeer intended this picture to be haunting visually and psychologically. And we've taken his bait, and, you know, that's part of being a great artist.
Did you ever see such ease as there is in this painting? Such concealment of effort? It was no small thing as that day for a Dutchman to lay his colours like this, so openly and lucidly. It is as though the paint evoked life rather than counterfeited it, as though the child had been waiting there behind the canvas to emerge at the touch of the brush. No wonder so many now flock to worship her.